you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there's the teaser line from Donald Trump as he addresses the NRA Leadership Forum in Nashville, Tennessee. If I run, and then he said, and people are going to be very surprised. The intimation there is that he will run, but he didn't say that, certainly. And I still find it hard to believe that Donald Trump will run for president, at least at this point, because he'd have to dump his TV shows. He'd have to open up all his finances. You know the drill. We've been through this before with Donald Trump. So time will tell. I like the fact that he's out there. I like the fact, I guess, that he introduced his sons and his daughter-in-law. I guess they got some free publicity out of that. But this has been a marvelous event. We've been bringing it to you all day right here on Newsmax television, and right up until the top of the end of this show, or the top of the hour, the end of the show before the Daily Wrap takes to the airwaves. We will continue it. And, of course, we brought you not only Donald Trump, but Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, Rick Perry, Jeb Bush, Ben Carson, Marco Rubio, all in this show. And then we had the exclusive interview following his speech to the convention with Ben Carson, who, among other things, told me to bet on him running if I were to go to Vegas and place a bet. And he said that an announcement as to whether or not he will run will come in May, first week in May. Ted Cruz is coming up next, ladies and gentlemen. Here he is.
God bless the NRA. So now, is this the Ready for Hillary gathering? You know, we had good news. Ready for Hillary had their first hire, the head of email security. So it's very, very good. Lois Lerner now has a job. You know, I started this morning at Fort Hood. At Fort Hood today, they finally, after over 5 years, awarded the Purple Heart. To the soldiers who were wounded or lost their lives on November 5th, 2009. For over 5 years, the Obama administration has insisted that what happened there wasn't terrorism. Nidal Hassan had communicated with Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical Islamic terrorist, had asked about the permissibility of waging jihad against his fellow soldiers. And then on that fateful day walked through Fort Hood screaming, Allahu Akbar, as he shot his fellow soldiers. And yet, shamefully, this administration characterized what happened there as workplace violence. Well, I'll tell you one of the things I was very proud to do. Last year, I introduced legislation in the United States Senate to mandate that we give the Purple Heart to the soldiers who deserve it. That legislation earned unanimous support on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We brought together Republicans and Democrats over the strong objection of the Obama administration. And this morning, those soldiers received the recognition that they deserved. It is a time for truth. You cannot win a war on radical Islamic terrorism with a president who's unwilling to utter the words, radical Islamic terrorism. Instead of a president who boycotts Prime Minister Netanyahu, imagine America standing unapologetically with the nation of Israel. Imagine a commander-in-chief standing up with clarity and saying, we will defeat radical Islamic terrorism. And under no circumstances will the nation of Iran be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. Some weeks ago, I joined with 46 other senators signing a letter that we sent to Iran, explaining that under the United States Constitution, there are only two ways something becomes a law. Either it is a treaty ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, or a law passed by both houses of Congress signed by the President. Well, the Obama White House went a little bit hysterical about that letter. I went on MSNBC, on Morning Joe, and they went a little bit hysterical about the letter. They asked, do you regret signing that letter? I said, the only thing I regret is, like John Hancock, that I didn't make my signature bigger. So that the Ayatollah could read it without his reading glasses. You know, we are at a time of crisis. Here at home, millions of people are hurting as the economy's in stagnation. Abroad, the Obama-Clinton foreign policy of leading from behind does not work. And we are seeing an unprecedented threat to our liberties each and every day from the federal government. And yet I want to tell you, I am inspired, I am optimistic, I am hopeful, and I'll tell you why. It's because of each and every one of you. NRA, the men and women here are men and women of action. You are leaders who stand and fight for your constitutional rights. This next election in 2016 is going to come down to a leader who will tell us the truth and who will do what he says he will do. Well, how do we distinguish? There are a lot of good men and women thinking about running in 2016. And we've been around the block before. We understand that in a Republican primary, everyone stands up and says, gosh diddly, I'm the most conservative guy who ever lived. And yet somehow actions don't always seem to follow those words. I was up in Iowa recently. A gentleman looked at me, asked the question, how can we trust you? It's the most important question. You know, I'll point out when I ran for Senate in the state of Texas, when people went to our website, you know, every website always has an issues page, A, B, C, D, and E. And in a Republican primary, people say word for word the exact same thing. I point it out all the time. If you go to our webpage, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. One of the first things people notice is we don't have an issues page. Instead, what it says is, for far too long, politicians have said one thing and done another. Every one of us should ask any candidate who shows up in front of you, you say you believe these principles. Show me. When have you stood up and fought for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? As the scripture says, you shall know them by their fruits. So here's the example I used over and over again in the state of Texas. The Second Amendment. In Texas, there's a right answer. I support the Second Amendment. Unless you are clinically insane. Even if you're a Democrat, that's the right answer in Texas. Now, I like to point out that if folks went to our website, I actually didn't say I supported the Second Amendment. I didn't say a word about what was hidden in the deep recesses of my heart. What I did say is that when I was the Solicitor General of Texas, I led a coalition of 31 states before the United States Supreme Court defending the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and we won 5-4, a landmark decision upholding that right. And then I linked to the 2010 NRA's Carter Knight Freedom Fund Award, given every year to one of the leading Second Amendment defenders in the country. You know, I had a former boss who used to say, if I'm ever accused of being a Christian, I'd like for there to be enough evidence to convict me. The same is true of being a conservative. In a Republican primary, every candidate's going to stand up and say, I oppose Obamacare. The question we ought to ask is, great, when have you stood up and fought to stop Obamacare? Every candidate is going to say they don't support amnesty. All right, great. When have you stood up and fought to stop the president's illegal and unconstitutional executive amnesty? You know, we all remember 2 years ago, the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook. Every one of us whose parents, it was heartbreaking to see those little children murdered by that lunatic. And yet we also remember the president's response. You know, President Obama had an opportunity then. He could have tried to bring people together in a bipartisan manner, to say, let's go after violent felons. Let's go after criminals. Let's protect our kids and stop the bad guys. But instead, he used it as an excuse to try to come after the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. Now, I got to tell you, in the weeks and months that followed Sandy Hook, if you guys were sitting in the Senate Republican lunch, you'd have jumped out the window. Because the sentiment was, this is unstoppable. This is a freight train. It can't be stopped. Let's get out of the way. And I'll tell you, I was proud to stand with my friends Mike Lee and Rand Paul in sending a very short two-sentence letter to Harry Reid that we said we will filibuster any legislation that undermines the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Now, we all know what happened. What that did is two things. It slowed it down, and it shined a light on what was happening. And that's when the men and women in this room began to take over. In the weeks that followed, each of you and millions of Americans lit up the phones. It started with 3 of us. By the end of the next week, we were up to 17 senators on the letter. Then we had our first vote. We needed to get to 41. We only got to 31. And all our friends in the media said, oh, you failed. You only got to 31. But like any meaningful military conflict, it's rarely won on the first skirmish. That 31 was a whip count. And suddenly each of you knew every senator that had voted against the Second Amendment, and heaven and earth descended on those senators. And thanks to the passionate leadership of the men and women in this room, when it came to the Senate floor, every single one of President Obama's proposals to undermine the Second Amendment was voted down on the Senate floor. That is the power of the men and women here. Our country is in crisis, yet we're going to pull back and change the path we're on. But the answer is not going to come from Washington. Even better, ma'am, it's going to come from you. The only way we will turn this country around is for millions of courageous conservatives to rise up and say, we will defend the Bill of Rights. We will get back to freedom and the Constitution. We're building a grassroots army all across this country. How many of y'all have your cell phones? If you are willing to stand and fight as part of that grassroots army, I want to encourage you to text the word Constitution to the number 33733. Let me give you that again. The number is 33733. If you would text Constitution, what we are working to do is energize millions of courageous conservatives to reignite the promise of America. You know, 58 years ago, my father fled Cuba. He had been in prison. He had been tortured as a teenager in Cuba. He came to America. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 in his underwear. He washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. Worked full-time, paid his way through school, went on to start a small business. Today, he's a pastor. When I was a kid, my father said to me over and over again, when we faced oppression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? That is why the men and women gathered here are standing up, because we are not prepared to lose our freedom. In 1835, the town of Gonzales, Texas, received an edict from Mexican General Santa Anna. He demanded that the Texians who lived in Gonzales hand over their guns and hand over the cannon that guarded the city. Well, the Texians responded to General Santa Anna by raising a flag. On that flag was a picture of the cannon and the simple legend underneath, "Come and take it." That was the opening battle of the war for Texas independence. And I'll tell you, we've seen in the news this weekend, Hillary Clinton is announcing for president.